For most people, Sun Tzu is nothing more than a quote machine, a name slapped onto Instagram posts, business slides, and startup pitch decks by people who have never actually sat down and read what he wrote. He's treated like a mystical philosopher of dominance, a prophet of aggression, a man obsessed with victory at any cost. But that version of Sun Tzu is not just incomplete, it's dangerously wrong. Because when you strip away the modern myths and motivational slogans, what you find is not a war addict or a battle romantic, but something far more unsettling and far more relevant to the modern world. Sun Tzu was a financial realist, a strategist who understood that the fastest way to destroy a state was not to lose a battle, but to win too many of them. Because he lived in a world where nations were not dying on the battlefield, they were dying afterward when the bills came due. And this is the part of Sun Tzu's genius no one talks about, because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Art of War is not a book about fighting, it's a book about cost, scarcity, and survival in a system bleeding itself dry. And once you see it that way, the entire text transforms from ancient poetry into a ruthless financial manual disguised as strategy. To understand why Sun Tzu thought this way, you have to understand the world that produced him, because his ideas were not born in calm reflection, but in economic panic during the late spring and autumn periods sliding into the Warring States era, a time when China was not a unified civilization, but a fractured battlefield of competing kingdoms, each convinced that one more war, one more campaign, one more decisive strike would finally secure dominance, and each pouring more men, more grain, more metal, and more tax revenue into armies that grew larger every decade, as warfare evolved from symbolic aristocratic skirmishes into industrial-scale mobilization long before the modern age. And what most people miss is that this transformation didn't just change how wars were fought, it changed how states functioned. Because once armies required hundreds of thousands of soldiers, war stopped being a military decision and became a financial one, and every campaign became a gamble against the future solvency of the state itself. In this world, the moment an army marched, the economic clock started ticking. Grain had to be harvested early, peasants were pulled from fields, carts and animals were requisitioned, weapons had to be forged, roads maintained, supply lines guarded, and none of this was free. Every mile increased cost, every day multiplied it, and a campaign that dragged on too long didn't just risk defeat, it risked famine, rebellion, currency collapse, and internal decay, which is why so many states of that era didn't fall to enemies at all, but imploded from within, exhausted by wars they technically won. And Sun Tzu saw this pattern clearly while others refused to look at it, because glory is easier to sell than accounting. This is why Sun Tzu is so often misunderstood in the modern world, because we read him like a philosopher when he was actually a risk manager. We quote him like a motivational speaker when he was really issuing warnings, and we celebrate his clever tactics without noticing that every single one of them is designed to reduce exposure, limit duration, and minimize financial bleed. Because Sun Tzu was not obsessed with how to defeat the enemy, he was obsessed with how to avoid bankruptcy while trying. The most revealing line in The Art of War appears before any discussion of deception or tactics, when Sun Tzu writes that war is of vital importance to the state, a phrase that modern readers gloss over, but in his time, vital meant dangerous, destabilizing, existential. And what he's really saying is this: war is not a tool you can casually use, it is a liability that can destroy everything you are trying to protect. And from that point on, the entire book reads like an attempt to contain that liability before it metastasizes. When Sun Tzu famously declares that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, he is not making a moral argument, and he is not promoting peace. He is explaining cost avoidance, the idea that the best outcome is the one that achieves your objective without triggering the expenses that would cripple you later, the same logic modern corporations use when they acquire competitors instead of entering price wars. And when he warns that no nation has ever benefited from prolonged warfare, he is not being philosophical. He is stating a fiscal law. Time is the most expensive variable in conflict, and wars that drag on destroy states not through defeat, but through attrition of resources, labor, trust, and cohesion. This lens explains everything else in the book, including Sun Tzu's obsession with speed, intelligence, and flexibility, because these are not heroic virtues, these are cost control mechanisms. Speed shortens campaigns, intelligence prevents wasteful deployments, flexibility avoids sunk cost fallacies, and deception reduces the need for brute force. And once you see that, you realize that Sun Tzu wasn't minimizing violence because he was gentle, he was minimizing it because violence is expensive. This perspective becomes even clearer when Sun Tzu talks about logistics, a section many casual readers skip, but which reveals the true heart of his thinking, because he calculates the cost of distance, explaining how transporting supplies drains the treasury faster than paying soldiers, how armies living off their own people collapse the agricultural base, and how every additional mile from home compounds loss. And this is not metaphor, it is a warning that war is a negative-sum transaction unless ruthlessly controlled, and that rulers who ignore logistics are not brave, they are reckless spenders gambling with national survival. Sun Tzu even reframes intelligence gathering, what we would now call data, as a financial investment with extraordinary returns, arguing that a single well-placed spy can save more wealth than an entire army can win, because information prevents misallocation of resources, and misallocation, in Sun Tzu's worldview, is the original sin of leadership, the same sin that modern states commit when they pour trillions into conflicts without understanding their real costs. Even his emphasis on discipline and organization is economic at its core, because disciplined armies waste less, defect less, loot less, and require fewer corrective measures, and behind every moral instruction lies an accounting truth. Disorder is expensive, chaos bleeds capital, and inefficiency kills states faster than enemies do. What makes Sun Tzu extraordinary is that he arrived at these conclusions in an age where most military thinkers glorified combat, honor, and sacrifice, while he quietly asked a question almost no one else was asking. What happens after the war? What happens to the treasury, the farms, the labor force, the legitimacy of the ruler, and the social fabric? And history proved him right, because the states that survived longest were not the most aggressive, but the most financially restrained, the ones that used war sparingly, strategically, and briefly, while the ones that chased endless campaigns collapsed under their own weight. And this is where Sun Tzu stops being an ancient curiosity and starts becoming disturbingly modern, because the same mistake he warned against has repeated itself again and again throughout history, from empires bled dry by World War I, to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, to modern superpowers trapped in decades-long conflicts that quietly hollow out budgets, morale, and trust. And in every case, the battlefield outcome mattered less than the economic aftermath, exactly as Sun Tzu predicted. Modern warfare has evolved technologically, but philosophically it has moved closer to Sun Tzu, not further away, because intelligence operations, cyber warfare, sanctions, proxy conflicts, and psychological pressure are all attempts to achieve strategic goals without triggering the catastrophic costs of total war. And whether leaders admit it or not, they are still operating inside Sun Tzu's balance sheet, still constrained by the same brutal reality. Power without financial discipline is temporary. The deepest lesson Sun Tzu offers is not about how to win, it's about how not to lose everything afterward, because states do not fail when armies retreat, they fail when treasuries empty, institutions fracture, and citizens lose confidence. And Sun Tzu understood that the true enemy of every civilization is not the rival across the border, but the internal exhaustion caused by unmanaged ambition. This is why The Art of War is ultimately a book about restraint, not aggression, about stewardship, not domination, and about understanding that strength is not measured by how hard you strike, but how long you can endure without breaking. And Sun Tzu's financial genius lies in his refusal to separate economics from power, because to him they were the same thing. He knew that every war is a balance sheet decision, every campaign a loan against the future, and every unnecessary battle a step closer to default. And rulers who treat war as a passion rather than a liability inevitably destroy the very state they claim to defend. Sun Tzu did not teach rulers how to conquer the world, he taught them how not to bankrupt themselves trying. And history, relentlessly, has confirmed that he was right. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore its math, it will charge you interest anyway.